On the morning of August 17th, 1943, Adolf Galland stood on a lonely railway platform in East Prussia carrying a message he knew could alter the fate of the Luftwaffe, perhaps even the course of the war itself. The air smelled of coal smoke, the station loudspeakers crackled with routine announcements, and yet the tension surrounding him felt anything but routine. Hours earlier, reports had come in from stunned German ground observers and shaken fighter pilots. American P-38 Lightnings, unmistakable with their twin booms and glittering silver skins, had been seen escorting bombers more than 150 miles inside German airspace. That was impossible, or at least it was supposed to be. Every calculation, every briefing from Göring's inner circle, every confident statement made at Luftwaffe headquarters insisted the Americans had no fighter capable of reaching that far. And yet Galland held in his hands the written testimonies, radar plots and combat notes that proved otherwise. As the train carrying Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring approached, Galland understood he was about to deliver the most important warning of his career. But he also knew the man he was about to confront had built his world around illusions, not intelligence. This was the moment the Luftwaffe's future would be tested, not in the skies over Europe, but in a brief conversation on a railway platform. The question at the heart of this story is painfully simple. What happens when a nation's leadership chooses denial over truth? And how many lives are lost because someone in power refuses to listen? This is the tragic beginning of a chain of decisions that would unravel the German fighter force, destroy its pilot corps, and hand the Allies control of the skies. It starts here, with Galland's warning echoing into the void, ignored by the only man with the authority to act. The sky over Europe burns. Summer 1943. By the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe had become a relentless blaze, consuming men, machines, and entire cities with mechanical regularity. Every dawn brought the droning engines of American B-17 and B-24s forming up over England, tightening into formations so vast they cast shadows on the fields below. The 8th Air Force was growing into a juggernaut, receiving new aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Yet inside Germany, confidence remained dangerously high. Hermann Göring still boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, the heart of German industry, let alone Berlin. Many in the high command clung to the belief that daylight bombing was suicidal and that American bombers, unescorted, were easy prey for German fighters. Meanwhile, the bomber crews crossing the North Sea paid a brutal price for every mile. Loss rates often reached 10% per mission, and entire squadrons vanished in minutes under the guns of Bf-109 and Fw-190. But despite these losses, the Americans kept coming, and they were learning, adapting, pushing deeper every week. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was beginning to show cracks. Veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and new recruits arrived with barely enough training to stay in formation, let alone survive combat. Even fuel shortages were beginning to pinch, limiting flight hours and weakening readiness. Yet Göring refused to believe the strategic situation was changing. To him, Allied fighters were short-range toys. They could never escort bombers into the German heartland. This assumption shaped every plan, every tactic, every decision, and it was about to be shattered in the most dramatic way imaginable. Galland's discovery, the impossible fighters. The first reports reached Galland like distant thunder, faint at first, then swelling into something undeniable. On August 17, 1943, as the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission unfolded, German ground observers near Ingolstadt radioed in a message that made no sense. Fast, twin-engine American fighters had been spotted deep in Bavaria, flying in tight escort formation alongside the bomber stream. Minutes later, Gruppenkommandeur engaged in the interception confirmed it. P-38 Lightnings, unmistakable with their distinctive double fuselage silhouette, were diving into combat far beyond the limits every German intelligence estimate insisted were possible. For months, Luftwaffe analysts had assured their commanders that the Americans possessed no fighter capable of escorting bombers into central Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt lacked the range. The P-38, while formidable at altitude, was believed restricted by fuel and drop tank limitations. But now Galland held the evidence, intercept logs showing P-38s appearing over Linz, Augsburg, and even as far as Regensburg itself. Combat reports from German pilots describing them as aggressive, determined, and apparently unconcerned about fuel, and captured fragments of jettisoned external tanks, proving the Americans had solved the range problem. In the hours after the raid, Galland pored over every document, every altitude chart, every eyewitness sketch. The implications were catastrophic. If these long-range P-38s were not a one-time anomaly, then the defensive strategy of the Reich, the entire structure of intercept planning, was built on a fatal misunderstanding. The Americans could now protect their bombers far deeper than expected, and the Luftwaffe had no new fighter on the horizon that could match such endurance. Galland realized the truth with a cold certainty. This was the turning point. If leadership responded intelligently, Germany might still adapt. If they refused, the Luftwaffe's days were numbered. With this grim understanding, he gathered the reports and prepared to confront Göring, unaware that the greatest danger to Germany's survival was not the P-38, but the blindness of its own command. The meeting that changed nothing. When Galland stepped forward on the railway platform at Göring's command stop in East Prussia, he did so with the urgency of a man carrying bad news that could still avert disaster. If only someone would listen. The Reichsmarschall arrived surrounded by aides, dripping with medals, his white gloves immaculate, his mood already darkened by the staggering losses of the day's raid. Galland wasted no time. He handed over the reports, pointed to the plotted radar tracks, cited the pilots' testimonies, and stated plainly, American long-range fighters had penetrated deep into Germany. P-38 Lightnings with external fuel tanks were now escorting bombers far beyond what German intelligence had believed possible. Göring scanned the papers with a scowl, shaking his head before Galland even finished speaking. "Impossible," he snapped. "Absolutely impossible. The Americans cannot do this." Galland, usually careful with his tone, reminded him that the evidence came from multiple Gruppen, that pilots had engaged the fighters directly, that the tanks had been recovered from German soil. Still, Göring cut him off. "I refuse to accept this nonsense. The Americans must not have long-range fighters, therefore they do not." His voice carried the finality of a decree, not a judgment. Attempting once more, Galland warned that unless the Luftwaffe adapted immediately, these escorts would soon reach Berlin itself. Göring turned away, dismissing him with a wave of his hand, and ordered that no staff officer was to speak of long-range American fighters again. The train whistle blew, and as the Reichsmarschall boarded, Galland felt the weight of a disaster settling into place. It was a moment of pure strategic blindness, a commander rejecting reality because it contradicted his pride. In that brief exchange, the Luftwaffe's chance to respond, to innovate, to restructure, to prepare, vanished. History would show that the deadliest wound to German air power was not inflicted by an American bullet, but by Göring's refusal to believe the truth placed right before him. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids. To understand the weight of Galland's warning, we have to look at the very raid that forced the truth into daylight. On August 17, 1943, two massive American bomber forces, 376 B-17s in total, took off in a bold double strike designed to cripple German industry. One force flew southeast toward the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, then continued to bases in North Africa. The other turned east toward Schweinfurt, home to the ball-bearing plants vital to nearly every German tank, aircraft and truck. It was one of the most ambitious missions the 8th Air Force had attempted, and from the start it was clear the Luftwaffe understood its importance. German fighters swarmed the formations in waves, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even ill-suited Bf-109s, and Ju-88s pressed into desperate daylight attacks. The Americans paid a terrible price. 60 bombers failed to return. Hundreds of airmen were killed, captured, or missing. And yet buried within this carnage lay the single detail that changed everything: the unmistakable presence of P-38 Lightnings soaring beside the bombers deep inside German airspace. For the Americans, the long-range capability had been achieved through large 300-gallon drop tanks and careful fuel management, a technical step the Luftwaffe had assumed would take another year to solve. Their appearance shattered the German assumption that bombers would always be vulnerable over Central Europe. Even though the Regensburg force reached its target and the Schweinfurt force inflicted significant damage, the Germans initially focused only on their tactical success, the number of bombers downed. What Göring failed to grasp was the strategic cost. The Americans had proven they could reach the Reich with fighter cover. The raid was not just a battle, it was a warning shot, a turning point disguised inside a bloody day of combat. And Galland was one of the few who understood what the numbers truly meant. Galland's reports and Göring's delusion. In the days following the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, Galland threw himself into compiling a detailed summary of the air battle, assembling every fragment of intelligence with the precision of a man trying to rescue a crumbling system. He gathered pilot debriefs describing P-38s appearing at altitudes above 25,000 feet near Regensburg itself. He logged the times of first contact, the geographic coordinates, the estimated fuel loads, the recovered auxiliary tanks, evidence so overwhelming that even the most reluctant commander should have been forced to reconsider long-held assumptions. Yet every report he sent upward met the same silent wall. Göring refused to circulate the findings, refused to acknowledge them during staff briefings, and even threatened officers who contradicted his belief that American fighters were short-legged toys incapable of deep penetration. Within the Luftwaffe hierarchy, officers quickly learned what conclusion they were expected to reach before the analysis had even begun. Intelligence officers toned down their language. Operations planners pretended the escort threat was temporary, and junior pilots were told that the sightings of P-38s were simply mistaken impressions in the chaos of battle. Meanwhile, Galland, as General de Jagdflieger, saw the consequences taking shape like storm clouds on the horizon. Without recognition of the long-range threat, German fighter tactics would not change. The deployment of interceptors would remain predictable, fuel reserves would be allocated to outdated priorities. The already strained training pipeline would continue producing pilots too inexperienced to survive against aggressive, well-escorted American formations. Galland wrote again, more urgently, warning that the Allies were closing the distance between England and Berlin not just with bombers, but with fighters designed to protect those bombers all the way to the target and back. His memos grew sharper, his tone grew darker. But none of it pierced Göring's conviction that the Luftwaffe remained the master of European airspace. In reality, the Reich's air defences were beginning to hollow out from the inside, collapsing under a leadership that preferred delusion to data. And Galland knew that each ignored report was another nail hammered into the coffin of Germany's fighter force. The rise of the long-range fighters. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the Americans unleashed a transformation that would redefine the air war, the systematic extension of fighter range until their escorts could follow bombers from England to the heart of Germany and back without ever abandoning them. The P-38 Lightnings that Galland had reported were only the beginning. Soon, modified P-47 Thunderbolts carrying 2 massive drop tanks appeared over Münster, then Kassel, then as far east as Oschersleben, each mission pushing deeper, each escort lasting longer. Their presence eroded the Luftwaffe's most reliable tactic, striking the bomber formations during the vulnerable stretches before and after target runs. By early winter, even that window began to close. Then came the aircraft that sealed the Luftwaffe's fate, the P-51 Mustang. Designed with a laminar flow wing and powered by the Packard-built Merlin engine, the P-51 combined extraordinary range with lethal agility. In December 1943, Mustangs escorted bombers to Kiel. In January, they reached Brunswick. By March, they were over Berlin itself, diving through German formations with a ferocity that stunned even veteran aces. The Luftwaffe pilots who once chose when and where to attack suddenly found themselves on the defensive from the moment they lifted off. Squadrons that had relied on altitude advantage now faced fighters that could climb faster. Units that specialized in head-on attacks were intercepted before they could form up. Even the feared Sturmgruppen, heavily armoured FW-190s designed to ram through bomber boxes, were torn apart before reaching firing range. Galland watched these developments with growing despair. He had warned that long-range escorts would strangle the Luftwaffe, and now the reality was worse than any prediction. The Americans had not simply extended their reach. They had achieved air superiority through a relentless combination of technology, production, and tactical innovation. Meanwhile, German aircraft development floundered, crippled by political infighting, unrealistic demands, and Göring's refusal to confront the truth. The sky, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, was now becoming an arena the Americans ruled with effortless dominance, while German pilots fought shorter, bloodier, and increasingly hopeless battles. The collapse of the Luftwaffe. By early 1944, the impact of Göring's denial was no longer theoretical. It was bleeding out across the skies of Germany with every rising sun. The crisis crystallized in February during Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. In just 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters, many of them flown by irreplaceable veterans whose experience could never be reproduced in the shrinking training hours allotted to new recruits. American long-range escorts, P-47s, P-38s, and increasingly the feared P-51 Mustangs, shadowed the bomber streams relentlessly, tearing into German formations before they could mount coordinated attacks. The once proud Jagdflieger groups that had dominated European airspace in 1940 and 1941 now suffered catastrophic attrition. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 100 flight hours, some with as few as 50, pitifully unprepared for combat against seasoned American squadrons. Fuel shortages worsened the situation beyond repair. Training units received so little aviation gasoline that new pilots rarely fired their guns before combat, and operational wings often had to choose between flying training sorties or launching intercept missions. Aircraft production, pressured by Allied bombing and internal chaos, couldn't keep pace with the losses. Factories were dispersed, supply chains strained, and engine reliability plummeted. Even when new aircraft like the Bf-109G6 or the FW-190A8 reached the front, they were no longer enough. The Allied fighter presence was overwhelming, constant, and impossible to evade. By the time the Normandy invasion began in June 1944, Galland's worst predictions had come true. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, could muster only 2 aircraft over the invasion beaches on D-Day. German ground troops looked to the sky expecting protection, but saw only contrails of Allied fighters sweeping overhead uncontested. The collapse was total, a combination of pilot attrition, fuel starvation, production setbacks, and the crushing reality Göring had refused to acknowledge back on that railway platform. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated in a single battle. It had been undone by months of strategic blindness and the unstoppable momentum of an enemy that learned faster, adapted quicker, and never stopped pushing deeper into the Reich. The lesson of denial. In the final months of the war, Galland found himself reflecting not only on the battles lost, but on the decisions that made defeat inevitable long before the Luftwaffe's last aircraft fell silent. What haunted him most was not the superiority of Allied machines or the sheer weight of American industry, but the way truth itself had been dismissed at the highest levels of command. In his post-war writings, Galland described a culture in which uncomfortable facts were treated as disloyalty, where officers tailored their reports to protect their careers rather than their pilots, and where Göring's pronouncements mattered more than the numbers coming from radar stations, intelligence analysts, or frontline squadrons. The tragedy, Galland wrote, was that the Luftwaffe still had opportunities to adapt in 1943. Opportunities to shift tactics, accelerate aircraft development, reorganize the training pipeline, and prepare defenses for the arrival of long-range escorts. But denial replaced strategy. Pride replaced planning. The Luftwaffe was not defeated because its pilots lacked courage. They displayed extraordinary bravery against overwhelming odds. It was defeated because its leadership refused to acknowledge reality until it was too late to change it. Galland's reports, ignored in August 1943, became a symbol of the broader collapse. When leaders silence truth, disaster follows with mathematical certainty. His experience offers a timeless lesson. Wars aren't lost only on battlefields. They are lost in conference rooms, at command tables, and on railway platforms where critical warnings are brushed aside. The fall of the Luftwaffe stands as a stark reminder that denial is not a shield. It is a poison that spreads through every decision until nothing remains standing. And for Galland, that realization was as bitter as any defeat suffered in the air. The echo of that railway platform. And so we return to that quiet railway platform in East Prussia, the place where history shifted not with the roar of engines or the flash of gunfire, but with a single warning dismissed in a moment of pride. Galland had stood there holding the truth, hard, unwelcome, undeniable, and he watched Göring wave it away as though reality itself could be commanded to retreat. Months later, as the skies above Germany filled with P-51 Mustangs and the Luftwaffe crumbled under the weight of losses it could no longer replace, that moment replayed itself in Galland's mind with painful clarity. He remembered the cold morning air, the steam drifting from the locomotive, the confident shake of Göring's head, and the finality of the words, "The Americans cannot do this." But they could, and they did. Every defeat that followed, the shattered Gruppen, the burned factories, the empty fuel tanks, the pilots who never returned, traced its lineage back to that refusal to listen. In the wreckage of 1944 and 1945, Galland understood that the Luftwaffe had not simply been outproduced or outmaneuvered, it had been undone by its own blindness. That platform, that conversation, became the symbol of a force that chose illusion over truth. And as the war drew to its close, Galland realized the most important lesson of all. When leaders deny reality, they do not delay the consequences, they magnify them. The warning Göring ignored in August 1943 did not fade. It echoed through every mission, every loss, every desperate flight, until the skies over Europe told the final verdict. Denial had grounded the Luftwaffe long before its aircraft fell from the sky.